I was born into one of the wealthiest families in the country. My parents arranged a marriage between me and the heiress of the Liu family. But what I never expected was that Willow Liu, the woman everyone in our social circle said was impossible to win over, actually agreed to the marriage. The problem was, she had already fallen for someone else. The only reason she agreed to marry me was because of pressure from her family. So, to win her over, I checked in on her every day, picked her up and dropped her off in luxury cars, and even showed up outside her company carrying huge bouquets of flowers. You could say I pursued her with everything I had, loudly, passionately, and so publicly that the whole city knew about it. Then one day, just as she was giving me the cold shoulder, I asked her, "So, when are you planning to tell your parents you want to call off the engagement?" The next second, I watched the panic spread across Willow's face. Chapter 1. George slammed the marriage agreement onto the mahogany desk with a loud thud that echoed through the silent CEO's office. "I'm not getting married." He leaned back in his leather chair, long legs casually crossed, his slender fingers tapping lazily against the armrest. Every word dripped with impatience. "If the old man keeps pushing me, I'll donate every share I own in the Wang Group." Standing across from him, his executive assistant, David, adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses without changing his expression. He calmly pulled a document from his briefcase and placed it on the desk. "Your father asked me to give this to you." George Wang glanced down. It was a draft declaration severing the father-son relationship. The corner of his mouth twitched. "Has the old man lost his mind? The chairman said that if you won't sign the marriage agreement, then you can sign this declaration instead. And if you refuse to sign either." David reached into his briefcase again and produced an envelope. "Then he asked you to read this." George opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter from his father, the bold strokes practically carving through the paper. It read, "You little brat. I've met the Liu family's daughter. She's better than all 8 of your ex-girlfriends put together. If you don't marry her, your mother will cry, your grandma will throw a fit, your sports cars will become mine, all your bank cards will be frozen for 3 years, and that luxury Riverview penthouse under your name is getting turned into a mahjong room. Think it over carefully, Dad." George tossed the letter onto the desk. "He's threatening me." David remained perfectly composed. "The chairman said this isn't a threat, it's a notice." Also, he added, "Miss Liu has already agreed." George shot upright. "What? The Liu family has informed us that Miss Willow has no objections and is willing to go through with the marriage." George froze. That Willow. The same Willow everyone said treated men like they didn't exist. The untouchable Ice Queen Northwest one dared get close to. She actually agreed. Frowning, George muttered, "What on earth is she thinking? Does she actually believe this is a good idea?" "I wouldn't know," David replied, adjusting his glasses again. "But the Liu family also said that once the marriage goes through, they'll hand the development rights for the South City project over to the Wang Group." George narrowed his eyes. This was how wealthy families operated. There were no fairy tale romances, only cold, calculated exchanges of interest. He and Willow Liu, one was the heir to the Wang Group. The other was the treasured jewel of the Liu family. To outsiders, they looked like the perfect power couple, a marriage between 2 elite families. But George knew better. He wasn't interested in her at all. He had met Willow countless times, at glittering banquets filled with champagne and socialites, at high-profile charity auctions, at exclusive parties packed with the city's elite. She was always standing quietly in a corner, like a lone orchid blooming far from the noise around her. She really was beautiful. Her face could have dominated the entertainment industry with ease. Her delicate features looked as though they'd been painted by a master artist. She had a straight nose, perfectly shaped lips, and a jawline so flawless that plastic surgeons could have used it as a reference. Her skin was almost translucent, and her tall, graceful figure made her look like a living work of art even when she stood perfectly still. But her personality was painfully boring. When she wasn't speaking, she was as cold as an iceberg, and when she smiled, well, George had never actually seen her smile. Rumor had it that Willow smiled fewer than 10 times a year, and every single one of those smiles was reserved for the ragdoll cat she kept. Worst of all, she absolutely hated physical contact. Chapter 2. Everyone in their circle knew that Miss Liu had extreme sensitivity to physical contact. At a charity gala, a male escort once attempted a cheek kiss greeting. Willow immediately took 3 steps back, her face turning as pale as paper, and had security escort him out on the spot. Another time, a socialite enthusiastically tried to link arms with her for a photo. Willow calmly sidestepped, leaving the woman's hand awkwardly suspended in midair. After incidents like these, one rule became unspoken but universally understood in elite circles. Willow is untouchable. Damn it. George ran a hand through his hair in frustration, his mind racing. Cute, soft-spoken girls who call people "gidge" or glamorous. Fiery, older sister types who can dance and charm. Any of them would be better than this ice-cold mountain of a woman. Who would willingly marry someone you can't even touch? That's basically signing up to worship a living statue. If he refused the marriage outright, the Wang group would take a heavy hit, and his father would definitely break his legs. If he agreed, then he'd have to endure Willow's frozen expression for the rest of his life. Stuck between a rock and a hard place, George Wang leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. Then suddenly, a scene flashed through his mind. That moment at the charity gala, Willow stepping back 3 paces, her face drained of color, visibly recoiling from contact. She hates enthusiasm. She avoids physical touch. And if he became someone who simply wouldn't leave her alone, someone sticky, annoying, impossible to shake off. George's eyes snapped open. He straightened up. David. Yes, sir. Get me everything on Willow. Every detail. Her classmates, friends, exes, roommates, what she likes, what she hates, her habits, her weaknesses. Within 3 days. I want a full background file, down to her family tree. David hesitated slightly. CEO Wang, what exactly are you planning to do? I'm going to do something, George said as he stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the city traffic below. A slow, mischievous grin formed on his lips, something that will make her want to call off the engagement herself. 3 days later, a thick stack of documents was placed on George's desk. He flipped through them, growing more and more excited. Willow, 26, graduated from Harvard Business School, current vice president of the Liu Group, cold personality, minimal social interaction, hobbies limited to reading, keeping cats, and drinking tea, no close friends during school years, avoids parties, dislikes physical contact. George's eyes lit up. Perfect. He kept reading. A university roommate interview was attached. Willow, she's a good person, just really hates physical contact. Once I was drunk and tried to hug her. She dodged like she was a rabbit. I joked and asked if she had germophobia, but she didn't answer. She just looked really uncomfortable. After that, none of us dared to touch her again. Another document came from a former Liu family housekeeper. Miss has never liked being hugged, even as a child. When Madam tried to hold her, she would avoid it. As she grew older, it became more obvious. She keeps her distance from everyone. Once her cousin tried to put an arm around her after drinking. She immediately walked away and didn't speak to him for 3 months. George read through the files 3 times. Then he leaned back in his chair, his smile widening little by little. This was perfect. A gift from heaven. Chapter 3. He picked up his phone and dialed his father. Dad, changed your mind? His father's voice came through the line with a hint of caution. George replied, yes, I have. His tone did a complete 180, sincere and obedient now. Dad, I've thought it through carefully. For the sake of the family's interests, I'm willing to go through with the marriage alliance. I'll sacrifice myself for the greater good. There was a 3-second silence on the other end. His father asked, are you serious? His voice was full of suspicion. He clearly knew his son too well. What are you plotting this time? Why would I? George sounded utterly innocent. Do I seem like that kind of person? His father replied, yes. George sighed. Dad, that really hurts. I do have my own considerations, but I'd like to ask you for a favor. Go on. I want to spend some time getting to know Willow first. 3 months. During this period, we meet more often and build some emotional foundation. After 3 months, if things go well, we'll officially get engaged. That would be more responsible for both sides. His father fell silent for a moment. The Liu family may not agree. George chuckled. Just talk to them. They'll agree. After all, a business marriage with some emotional foundation is more stable than a forced one, isn't it? After a pause, his father finally said, I'll try. Thanks, Dad. George hung up, then turned to David. Plan starts now. David hesitated. CEO Wang, are you sure about this? Of course. George stood up, straightening his tie, a mischievous glint in his eyes. Just wait. In less than 3 months, Willow will be crying and begging her father to break off the engagement. His plan was flawless, absolutely perfect. Willow hated overly enthusiastic people, then he would become one. She disliked physical contact, then he would stick to her every single day. Message bombardment, constant dates, close proximity, slipping physical contact in wherever possible. With Willow's personality, surviving a week would already be a miracle. A month would be impossible. If she could endure a full month, he'd write his name backwards. By then, she'd be the one unable to stand it and would initiate the cancellation herself. George would become the victim. Neither the old man nor the Liu family could blame him. Not only would he walk away clean, he could even sell himself a devoted, warm-hearted man image in high society. The distance between us is 100 steps. I've already taken 99, but she still refuses to take the last one. A genius. Whoever came up with this was a genius. Why was Newton or Gauss born before me? Was it that the early bird catches the worm, or that they were avoiding my brilliance? Chapter 4. 2 days later, George's father sent word that the Liu family had agreed. and Willow Liu herself had no objections. Thus, under the arrangement of both families, the trial relationship period officially began. For their first official date, George chose a trending internet-famous cafe. He had David thoroughly research it in advance. The cafe was famous as a couple's check-in spot, with walls covered in couple photos, seating arranged as double swings, and couple sets featuring 2 drinks connected by a single heart-shaped straw. Even the background music was a continuous loop of sweet love songs. George arrived 10 minutes early. He sat on the double swing with his legs casually crossed and began typing rapidly on WeChat. "Willow, I'm here. The weather is nice today. Perfect for meeting. The cafe is great. I'm sure you'll like it. I miss you. Come quickly." Then he added, "By the way, where are you? Do you want me to pick you up? Looking forward to seeing you." Another message followed immediately. "Why aren't you replying? I understand. It's fine. I really understand. I won't force you, even if you never reply. It's okay. After all, how many people in this world can truly understand each other? It's fine. I don't blame you. I probably said too much and disturbed you. I understand." After sending 5 messages, George leaned back with satisfaction. 3 minutes later, Willow replied with a single line, "Here." George looked up. At that exact moment, the cafe door was pushed open. Willow walked in. She was wearing an ivory silk blouse, paired with black wide-leg trousers, and a light gray trench coat. Her long hair was casually tied back, revealing a slender and elegant neck. She appeared cold, refined, and distant, like an ink painting suddenly placed inside a brightly colored internet-famous cafe. Several tables nearby instinctively turned to look at her. George had to admit it. She was truly beautiful. Beautiful enough to make people ignore her cold expression. Beautiful enough to make everything around her seem dull in comparison. But beauty meant nothing to him. He wasn't interested in that type. George snorted inwardly. Then he stood up. His face instantly transformed into the brightest, most exaggerated, and most overly enthusiastic smile of his life. "Willow." He opened his arms and walked directly toward her. Willow's steps visibly paused. She looked at the approaching man, at those clearly outstretched arms, and her pupils contracted slightly. George accurately predicted her instinct. Step back, sidestep, create distance. But he did not give her the chance. In one smooth motion, his arms wrapped around her waist. He pulled her directly into his embrace. Close, firm, no space left between them. "Finally seeing you," George said, resting his chin lightly on her shoulder, deliberately lowering his voice into something soft and intimate. "I missed you." Warm breath brushed against her ear. "We haven't seen each other in a long time, Willow." He could feel it immediately. Her body stiffened, completely still, like a wooden sculpture, like a string pulled to its limit. Every muscle in her body tightened under his hold. Through the thin fabric of her blouse, he could even feel her heartbeat accelerating. Her breathing became shallow and tense, as if she was forcing herself to suppress her reaction. Chapter 5. George was over the moon inside. It was working. It was working perfectly. "George." Willow's voice came through, cold as shards of ice. "Let go." "I won't. I won't." George not only refused, but tightened his hold even more. His arms locked around her waist like iron restraints. He even deliberately brushed his face against the crook of her neck, exhaling lightly against her skin on purpose. "Willow, you smell really nice." "What perfume is that?" "It smells amazing." He felt Willow tremble slightly in his arms, a suppressed tremor at its limit, like a volcano about to erupt. George had already prepared himself to be pushed away. In fact, he had even rehearsed the lines in his head. "Willow, why are you pushing me away? I just want to be a little closer to you. Don't you like it?" That pitiful, slightly aggrieved tone, he was certain it would make her snap on the spot. But 1 second passed, 2 seconds passed, 3 seconds passed. Willow didn't push him away. George froze. He turned his head and met Willow's eyes. Those always calm and unreadable eyes were now churning with emotions he couldn't decipher. Shock, confusion, and something else he couldn't name, but there was absolutely none of the disgust or anger he had expected. She stared at his face, so close to hers, for a full 5 seconds. Then she took a deep breath. With that breath, her stiff, tightly wound body actually began to relax, like ice slowly melting in warm water. Her shoulders, arms, and back gradually released their tension, one layer at a time. Finally, she said one word, "Fine." Her voice was light, almost like a sigh. George's mind went blank for a moment. Wait. What was that? This wasn't how the script was supposed to go. Shouldn't she have said coldly, "George, show some respect," then pushed him away and stormed off? "What do you mean, fine?" "Willow," George tested carefully, still not letting go. Willow lowered her gaze, her lashes hiding the emotions in her eyes. She didn't struggle, didn't step back. She just stood quietly in his arms, like a cat that had finally found a place to curl up. "You want to hold me, don't you?" she said calmly. Then hold me. George was speechless. No, this wasn't the reaction he wanted at all. His plan was, he hugs her, she resists, he persists, she breaks down, and then she calls off the engagement. But now, he hugs her, and she says fine. How was he supposed to continue this? He was completely stuck. After standing rigid for 3 seconds, George could only force the scene forward. He cleared his throat. Then let's sit down. The double swing here is really romantic. I picked it specially. He let go of her waist, then took her hand instead, interlacing their fingers. His thumb deliberately brushed against the back of her hand in a slow, suggestive motion. He felt Willow's fingers curl slightly. A reaction. Finally, a reaction. Chapter 6. George's hope flared up again. Beaming, he took her hand and led her over to the two-person swing before sitting down. The swing was not big. If 2 people sat on it, they had to be pressed close together. He deliberately squeezed toward Willow. His thigh touched hers, his shoulder leaned against hers, and his whole body clung to her like a piece of tape she could not shake off. Willow, what do you want to drink? He held the menu up in front of her, his face almost brushing her cheek. The cappuccino art here is really pretty. How about we each get one? The kind with a heart on top. Whatever. Willow said. Hey, not whatever. George looked at her seriously and said, this is our first official date. I have to take it seriously. I want to know what flavors you like. What do you usually drink? Americano, latte, mocha, caramel macchiato. He rattled off 7 or 8 names in a row, speaking as fast as a salesman. Willow glanced at him and said, Americano. Got it. George immediately raised his hand. Waiter, 2 Americanos. Oh, by the way, do you have any couple sets here? The waiter smiled and said, yes, we do. We have a Forever Together couple set. It comes with 2 Americanos and 1 piece of tiramisu. The tiramisu is heart-shaped. That one. George made the decision at once. Then he turned to Willow with a smile. Willow, we'll share the same piece of cake. You don't mind, right? Willow fell silent for a moment, then said, suit yourself. Again with the suit yourself. George gritted his teeth inwardly. It was fine. This was only the beginning. She must be holding herself back. After all, they were in public, so it was inconvenient for her to lose her temper. Once he turned things up to full blast, he guaranteed she would not be able to keep enduring it. The set was brought over. 2 Americanos and 1 heart-shaped tiramisu. George picked up the fork, cut off a small piece of cake, and lifted it to Willow's lips. Willow, come on, open up. I'll feed you. Willow looked at the fork in front of her, then looked at George's bright smile. A flicker of emotion passed through her eyes, something George could not understand. No need, she said. Yes, need. George refused to give up. He moved the fork a little closer until it almost touched her lips. It's only natural for your fiancé to feed you. Come on, open up. He deliberately dragged out the in a long, sickeningly sweet voice. Even he felt like throwing up after hearing it. Willow looked at him and stayed silent for a full 5 seconds. Then she opened her mouth and ate the cake. George's hand froze in midair. No way. Girl, why did you actually eat it? Is it good? George asked, forcing himself to keep acting. Willow gently dabbed the corner of her mouth with a napkin and said, too sweet. Then don't eat it. Let's drink coffee. George immediately shifted targets. He picked up her coffee cup and stirred it slowly with a small spoon. Willow, do you usually like Americano? It's so bitter. How can you even drink that? Willow said, I'm used to it. George looked at her with a pained expression. That won't do. Now that you have me, your life doesn't have to be so bitter. I'll add sugar for you. After saying that, he poured an entire packet of sugar into her Americano. Willow looked at the Americano he had defiled, and her brows furrowed almost imperceptibly. George was secretly delighted. Let's see if you still don't crack. But Willow said nothing. She lifted the coffee cup and took a sip. Too sweet, she said. George grinned. Hey, sweeter is better. From now on, every day of your life will be this sweet, because I'll stick to you like malt candy. Willow's hand paused around the coffee cup. She lifted her eyes and looked at George. Her gaze was clear and cold, like a lake in deep winter, and for some reason, it made George feel a little guilty. Chapter 7. She suddenly spoke. George, what? Willow asked. When did you start liking me? George's heart skipped a beat. This question had not been part of his preparation. He quickly searched his mind for an answer and stammered. It was just, actually, I noticed you a long time ago. There was a charity dinner once. You were wearing a dark green dress, and I saw you right away. Willow said calmly. I've never worn a dark green dress. George was speechless. George felt sweat beginning to form on his forehead. He brushed it off casually and said, I can't really remember clearly. Anyway, there was this one time when I saw you from far away. I thought you were especially beautiful. And then, Willow asked, and then you fell for me? Yes. George said as if he had been granted a pardon. That's exactly it. Willow looked at him without saying anything. The corners of her lips seemed to move slightly, but the movement was so small that George was not sure whether it was a smile. Willow nodded and said, "Got it." After saying that, she continued drinking her coffee. George let out a breath of relief, thinking he had passed this hurdle. However, he did not know that the moment he lowered his head to eat the cake, Willow's gaze fell on him, and a trace of tenderness almost impossible to notice flashed through her eyes. That tenderness vanished in an instant, so fast it seemed like an illusion. After they finished eating, George suggested going shopping. Shopping. Willow's expression finally changed a little. George said as if it were only natural, "Yeah, isn't a couple's date supposed to include shopping and watching a movie? There's a shopping street nearby. Let's go walk around." Willow was silent for 2 seconds before saying, "I don't like crowded places." George shamelessly leaned closer and grabbed her hand. "I'll be there with you," he said. "Besides, it's a weekday. There won't be many people. Come on, let's go. Just think of it as a walk to help digestion." He half-pulled, half-dragged Willow out of the cafe. There really were not many people on the shopping street. The sunlight was just right, shining down on the roadside trees and casting mottled shadows. George held Willow's hand and kept chattering the whole way. "Willow, look at that tree. It's so pretty, but not as pretty as you. Should I take a photo of you?" "Willow, there's someone selling balloons over there. Should I buy you one? What color do you like?" "Willow, the ice cream from that shop looks really good. Wait here, I'll go buy some." He bought a strawberry cone and held it out in front of Willow. "Try it." Willow looked at the cone, hesitated for a moment, then took it. George urged her, "Take a bite." Willow took a small bite. George asked, "Is it good?" "It's okay," George immediately said. "Then let me try it." He leaned over and took a bite of the cone from her hand. It really is okay, but it's not as sweet as you." After saying that, he even winked at her. Willow looked at the ice cream cone he had bitten, then at the corner of his mouth stained with cream. Her gaze turned subtle. "What's wrong?" George asked. "Nothing." Willow looked away. They kept walking. When they passed a boutique, George's eyes lit up, and he pulled Willow inside. "Willow, look at this." He picked up a pair of couple bracelets. Hanging from the silver chains were 2 small half-heart pendants that formed a whole heart when put together. "Let's buy these." "Okay, you wear one, and I'll wear one," Willow commented. "Childish." "It's not childish, it's called romance." Without giving her a chance to object, George put the bracelet on Willow's wrist. Willow's wrist was very slender. The silver chain rested on it, making her skin look even fairer. "So pretty." George admired his own work, then put the other bracelet on his own wrist. "Perfect. From now on, we'll wear them every day. No taking them off." Willow lowered her head and looked at the chain on her wrist without saying anything. George thought she was holding back her displeasure, and he secretly felt pleased. But what he didn't know was that from that day on, Willow wore that bracelet every single day. She wore it during meetings, on business trips, and even never took it off when she showered. Of course, that was something he only found out much later. Chapter 8. After coming out of the boutique, George dragged Willow to the movie theater. He deliberately chose a cheesy romance movie that lasted 2.5 hours. Inside the theater, George pulled the same trick again. First, he lifted the armrest to close the distance between them. Then, pretending to be moved by the movie, he rested his head on Willow's shoulder. "Willow, this is so touching," he said in a muffled voice, rubbing against her shoulder. Willow did not move at all. George reached out again and held the hand she had placed on her knee. "Your hand is so cold." He frowned, wrapped her hand in his palm, and slowly rubbed it. "Why is it so cold? Is the air conditioning too strong?" "I'm not cold," Willow said. George said righteously, "That still won't do. Girls have to keep warm." After saying that, he pulled her hand over and placed it on his own knee, covering it with both of his hands. "I'll warm it up for you." Willow's hand curled slightly in his palm. George was secretly delighted. She reacted. She was about to lose her composure. He pushed even further, sliding his fingers between hers until their hands were tightly interlocked. Leaning close to Willow's ear, he said in a low voice, "This way is warmer." He could feel Willow's breathing falter for a moment. By the time the movie ended and they walked out of the theater, it was already dark. "I'll take you home," George said. "No need," George insisted. "I have to. It's so late. I won't feel at ease letting you go back alone." Willow glanced at him and did not refuse again. When they arrived downstairs at Willow's apartment building, George stopped the car. He turned to Willow with a smile and said, "I had a great time today. Shall we continue our date tomorrow?" "I have a meeting tomorrow," Willow said. George waved his hand. "That's fine. You go to your meeting, and I'll wait for you." "What time does it end?" "I'll pick you up from the company." Willow was silent for a few seconds before saying, 5 in the afternoon. "Great. I'll be there right on time at 5. George smiled even more brightly. "Good night, Willow." Willow got out of the car. After taking 2 steps, she turned back and glanced at him. It was only a brief look, but George somehow felt there was something hidden in her eyes that he could not understand. "Good night," she said, then turned and went upstairs. George sat in the car and watched her figure disappear into the entrance of the building. Then he let out a long breath. Round 1 was over. He took out his phone and sent David a message. Day 1. The target showed clear discomfort but is still holding back. The plan is initially effective. Tomorrow, I'll turn up the intensity. After sending the message, he leaned back in the driver's seat and recalled every little detail from the day. Willow's stiff body, her furrowed brows, her curled fingers, her avoiding gaze, all these details proved that his plan was working. But that "suit yourself" still made him faintly uneasy. Still, it was fine. This was only the first day. With George's level of clinginess, Willow would wave the white flag and surrender in less than a week. Full of confidence, he started the car and drove out of the residential complex. However, what he did not know was that after he left, Willow was standing in front of the floor-to-ceiling window of her apartment. Watching his taillights disappear into the night, she lowered her head and looked at the couple bracelet on her wrist. The silver heart-shaped pendant gleamed under the light. Then she picked up her phone. On the screen were the 5 messages George had sent today, along with a newly sent good-night message. It read, "Good night, Willow. Your baby's battery is drained. Charging now. See you tomorrow." She scrolled through them one by one, reading those few messages from beginning to end 3 times. Then she unlocked the encrypted album on her phone with her fingerprint. There was only one folder in the album. She opened it. Inside was a photo. It was from a cocktail party last year. George stood among the crowd in a dark blue suit. His head turned slightly as he spoke to someone. His eyes were bright, and there was a hint of a carefree, cynical smile at the corner of his mouth. The angle of the photo was awkward. It was clearly taken in secret. Willow looked at the photo, her fingertip gently tracing George's side profile on the screen. Softly, she said, "Finally." The rest of her words were scattered by the night wind, and no one heard them. Chapter 9. At 4:50 in the afternoon the next day, George appeared downstairs at Liu Group right on time. Today, he had changed into a new outfit, a light blue casual suit with a white t-shirt underneath. His hair was styled in a fluffy, effortless way, making him look like a male model who had just stepped out of a fashion magazine. But the thing in his hands looked completely out of place with his outfit. A huge bouquet of red roses, 99 roses, arranged into an exaggerated heart shape, with a handwritten card tucked into it, "To my beloved Willow. May you be happy every day." From George. George stood at the entrance of the Liu Group building holding the bouquet, drawing so much attention that people practically looked back twice. David, standing beside him, asked tentatively, "CEO Wang, should I hold it for you?" "No need. I'll hold it myself." George refused with a smile. "This is exactly the effect I want." He wanted everyone to see that George was pursuing Willow passionately, publicly, and loudly enough for the whole city to know. George glanced at his watch. 4:58. He cleared his throat and strode into the Liu Group building. In the lobby, the receptionist froze for a moment when she saw his grand entrance. "Sir, may I ask?" "I'm here for Willow." George smiled slightly. "I'm her fiancé." He said the word fiancé loudly and clearly, and everyone in the lobby heard it. Countless gazes shot toward him at once. "So it's CEO Wang." The receptionist quickly stood up. "She's in a meeting. It should be ending soon. Would you like to go upstairs and wait?" "No need. I'll wait here," George said. "I want her to see me the moment she comes out." Holding the bouquet, he stood in the most eye-catching spot in the lobby with a perfect smile on his face. Time passed second by second. At exactly 5 o'clock, the elevator doors opened with a ding. Willow walked out. She was wearing a sharp professional outfit today, a dark gray blazer with a matching fitted skirt. Her hair was pinned up behind her head, revealing her slender neck. She had light makeup on, and there was a trace of fatigue between her brows. The moment she stepped out of the elevator, she saw George. When she saw the enormous bouquet of red roses, her footsteps paused. "Willow." George walked toward her with the flowers in his arms, his smile as bright as May sunshine. He said eagerly, "Your meeting is over. You worked hard. These flowers are for you." He stuffed the bouquet into Willow's arms. 99 roses were not light. Willow instinctively caught them, and most of her body was immediately blocked by the bouquet. Low gasps sounded throughout the lobby. "That's so romantic. Willow's fiancé is so handsome. 99 roses. Oh my God." Willow poked her head out from behind the bouquet, looked at George, then looked at the flowers in her arms. She pressed her lips together and said, "Thank you. You're welcome." George wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Let's go. I'll take you to dinner. I booked a really good private restaurant." With his arm around Willow, he led her out of the lobby, collecting countless envious looks along the way. George was feeling extremely pleased with himself. See, this kind of over-the-top romance was definitely something Willow couldn't stand. Someone like her surely hated becoming the center of attention. He secretly glanced at Willow, trying to find a trace of discomfort on her face. However, Willow simply held the flowers quietly and got into the car with him. Inside the car, George continued his offensive. Willow, was the meeting tiring today? Are your shoulders sore? I'll give you a massage later. Willow replied, no need. Yes, there is. I'm your fiancé. Taking care of you is my responsibility. George held the steering wheel with one hand and reached over with the other to take her hand. After dinner tonight, shall we go for a walk? The night view by the river is especially beautiful. Okay, George continued. Then I'll take you home. You can take a bath and relax. If you're tired, I'll run the bathwater for you. Okay. George's smile didn't change, but inside, he was calculating. Why hasn't she snapped yet? Am I not going far enough? Looks like I need to step it up. Chapter 10. When they arrived at the private dining restaurant, George had booked a couple's private room. The lighting inside the room was dim. Candles were lit on the table, and in the center was a two-person sofa. Yes, there were no chairs, only a two-person sofa. George and Willow sat side by side on the sofa, their bodies inevitably pressed together. Willow, what do you want to eat? George spread out the menu and leaned sideways, his chin almost resting on her shoulder. I recommend the crab cakes here. They're really fresh. His breath brushed against Willow's ear, carrying a faint scent of mint. The tips of Willow's ears turned red at a visible speed. George sharply caught this detail and cheered inwardly. Oh ho, her ears are red. She must be disgusted by me. Willow said softly. Whatever. Her voice was a little lower than usual. Fine, then I'll just order whatever. As George ordered, he deliberately leaned closer to her. His arm pressed against Willow's arm, and his thigh touched hers. Through the thin fabric of their clothes, he could feel her body warmth. After ordering, George took out his phone and started sending Willow WeChat messages. Do you like today's roses? You look so beautiful holding the flowers. I secretly took a picture. You outshone the flowers. Image. Willow, did you think of me during your meeting today? Expectant. I was thinking about you the whole time. Heart. Willow's phone kept vibrating on the table. She picked it up and glanced at it, then looked up at George. Speechlessly, she said, you're sitting right next to me. George said confidently, I still want to send them. This is romance. He continued sending messages. Willow, your side profile is so beautiful. Kiss. Willow, what shampoo do you use? It smells so good. Curious. Willow, your outfit today looks amazing. Yesterday, you were a fairy. Today, you're a queen. Willow looked at the string of messages and fell silent for a few seconds. Then she lowered her head and started typing. She sent, you look good today too. George froze. She actually replied, and even complimented him. George replied, really? You like it? Then I'll wear this for you every day from now on. Willow replied, George asked again, what style do you like? Casual, formal, sporty. Willow answered, all of them are fine. Then I'll wear all of them for you. Happy, happy. After typing this line, even George almost could not keep acting anymore, no matter how he looked at it. This conversation seemed like one between a real couple in love. No, that was not right. She must be brushing him off. Just like before, she said whatever on the surface, but deep down, she was annoyed to death. That had to be it. After giving himself a mental pep talk, George put down his phone and started being clingy in person again. Willow, drink some water. He picked up her glass and held it to her lips. I can do it myself. George insisted. No, I'll feed you. Come on, open your mouth. Willow looked at him and stayed silent for 2 seconds. Then she opened her mouth. George carefully brought the glass to her lips and watched her take 2 sips. Does it taste good? He asked. Willow said speechlessly. It's just water. George grinned. Water tastes better when I feed it to you. He put down the glass. From now on, I'll feed you water every day. Willow lowered her eyes, her eyelashes trembling slightly. The dishes were served one after another. George began his feeding attack. Willow, this shrimp is so tender. Try it. He picked up a shrimp and held it to her lips. Willow hesitated. I can do it myself. No refusing. George interrupted her. I ordered this especially for you. You have to eat it. Willow opened her mouth and ate the shrimp. Is it good? It's good. Then have another. George picked up another one. I can do it myself. No, I have to feed you. George brought the shrimp to her mouth. Come on, open up. Willow ate it again. George fed her one bite after another. Shrimp, tofu, vegetables, beef. He wished he could feed the entire table of food into Willow's mouth. Willow reminded him, you haven't eaten yet. George said with deep affection. Looking at beauty is enough to fill me up. I only need to watch you eat. Willow lowered her head and said nothing. George thought his cheesy line had grossed her out, and he was secretly delighted. But what he didn't notice was that the moment Willow lowered her head, the corners of her lips lifted ever so slightly. Chapter 11. After dinner, George dragged Willow to the riverside for a walk. The night breeze was slightly cool. The lights from both sides of the river reflected on the water, shimmering with ripples. George took off his jacket and draped it over Willow's shoulders. "Don't catch a cold," he said. Willow tightened the collar of the jacket. It still carried George's body warmth and the faint scent of his cologne. She asked, "What about you?" "I'm not cold." As George spoke, he naturally wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "This way. It'll be warmer too." The two of them walked along the riverside for a while. George kept talking. From the scenery by the river to embarrassing stories from his childhood. From little work matters to the latest gossip. Willow listened quietly, occasionally replying with one or two words. George suddenly asked, "Willow, do you think I'm annoying?" He wanted to test her limits. Willow paused. She turned her head and looked at George. The river breeze lifted the loose strands of hair on her forehead, revealing her clear eyes. "No," she said. George froze. This answer was beyond his expectations. He pressed further. "You really don't find me annoying?" "No." George frowned and asked, "Then if I cling to you like this every day from now on, you still won't be annoyed?" Willow fell silent. She turned her head and looked at the river. Then she said, "No." Her voice was very soft, as light as a sigh carried by the river breeze. George's heart skipped a beat, and an ominous feeling rose inside him. Even he was getting annoyed by himself. How was she still not annoyed? Over the next week, George took clinginess to the extreme. Every morning at exactly 6, he sent her a message. "Good morning. Are you awake, baby? I left your breakfast at the breakfast shop. You can buy it if you spend a little money. I also left your coffee at the coffee shop." Willow replied, "Morning." Every hour, he sent another message. "What are you doing? Are you busy? What did you have for lunch? Take a picture and show me. You're too thin. Eat more meat. Drink more water. Kiss emoji. I'm giving you a kiss. Remember to return the favor." Willow occasionally replied with one or two words. Meeting. 8. Okay. Every night, he called her. Sometimes the calls lasted 10 minutes, sometimes an hour. On the phone, he could talk about everything that had happened that day from morning to night. Even if he saw a cat on the road that reminded him of her, he would describe it in 300 words. Willow listened quietly, occasionally giving a soft mm. Every few days, he went to wait for her downstairs at Liu Group. He never showed up empty-handed. One day it was roses, the next day it was limited edition chocolates, and the day after that it was a handmade accessory from some niche designer. He went to her apartment more and more often. At first, it was twice a week. Then it became every other day. In the end, he simply went every day. He carried out his clingy plan with unwavering determination, but without knowing when it had started. He had memorized all of Willow's preferences. One day, when Willow was hosting him, she casually mentioned, "The tea in my office is finished." The next day, George asked David to contact tea farmers in Wui Mountain. 3 days later, a box of first spring harvest Jinjinmai tea was delivered to Willow's office. When Willow received the tea, she sent him a message. "How did you know I like this?" George stared at that message for a long while. How did he know? Because it had been written in the information David had found for him. George replied, "Because I care about you." Willow did not reply, but that afternoon, she took the initiative to send him a message. "The tea is very good. Thank you." That was the first time she had ever messaged him first. George stared at that message for a long time, and a strange feeling rose in his heart. He shook his head, throwing away those messy thoughts. Stay true to the original goal, and see it through to the end. His goal was very clear: make Willow call off the engagement. Chapter 12. So he intensified his efforts again. He started sending Willow photos of himself from childhood. His bare-bottom 100-day baby photo, his snot-nosed elementary school photo, his acne-covered middle school photo from puberty. He dug out every embarrassing piece of history he had. George sent, "Look, this is what I looked like when I was little." Image. Willow replied, "Very cute." George sent another one. "Really? What about this one?" "This was when I looked the worst." Image. "Not ugly." "What? Even a chubby kid with a face full of acne isn't ugly." "Not ugly." George stared at the words, "not ugly," and fell into deep confusion. Did she have no sense of aesthetics? That night, George went to Willow's apartment as usual. He sat on the sofa and watched Willow make tea in the open kitchen. For some reason, he suddenly felt that the scene was indescribably harmonious. Willow was wearing loungewear, a loose beige knitted sweater and dark gray cotton pants. Her hair fell casually around her shoulders. She looked completely different from her usual image as a strong career woman. At this moment, she seemed soft and warm. She placed a cup of black tea in front of George and said, "Your tea." "Thank you." George picked up the cup, took a sip, and said, "You're getting better and better at this. You come here often now." Willow sat across from him, holding a cup of tea as well. She curled up in the corner of the sofa, her legs tucked beneath her and both hands wrapped around the cup. Her posture made her look just like a lazy cat. George looked at her side profile and suddenly asked, "Willow, don't you feel lonely living alone in such a big place?" Willow paused. She lowered her head and looked at the tea in her cup, staying silent for a long time. Then she said, I'm used to it. George pressed further. Used to being lonely? It's not exactly lonely, Willow said. I have a cat. As soon as she finished speaking, a chubby ragdoll cat sauntered over from the corner, jumped onto the sofa, and curled up beside Willow's legs. Willow reached out and stroked its back, and the cat let out a satisfied purr. George asked, "What's its name?" "Dough." "Dough." George laughed. It really does look like a lump of dough. He reached out to pet the cat too. Dough lifted its head warily, glanced at him, then reluctantly allowed him to touch it once. Willow said, "It doesn't really get close to strangers." George said casually, "Then I'll have to come over more often so it gets used to me." Willow looked at him but said nothing. That night, George stayed until after 9 before leaving. Before he left, he hugged Willow as usual. "Good night, babe," he said beside her ear. "Good night." Willow's voice was muffled against his chest. George let go and lowered his head to look at her. Willow's eyes were lowered, her eyelashes casting a small shadow under the light. He suddenly felt that this version of Willow was actually quite cute. No, what was he thinking? George fiercely slapped himself in his mind. He needed a stronger dose. Chapter 13. That weekend, George took Willow to an amusement park. This was his new plan. Amusement parks were crowded, noisy, and chaotic. The easiest places to make someone irritated. Add in all those thrilling rides, and Willow would definitely be unable to stand it. Sure enough, as soon as they entered the amusement park, Willow frowned. "I don't like crowded places," she said. "It's the weekend. Of course there are a lot of people." George tightened his grip on her hand to keep them from being separated by the crowd. "Don't be scared. I'm here." He led Willow through the crowd and headed straight for the first ride, the carousel. Willow looked at the colorful wooden horses and asked, "We're riding this?" George helped her onto one of the horses. "Yes, it's a must-do for couples. You sit on this pink one, and I'll sit on the blue one next to you." The music started, and the carousel began to spin. George sat on the horse beside her and waved at her. "Willow, look over here." He raised his phone and snapped 7 or 8 photos. Willow sat on the carousel horse, looking a little uncomfortable, but she still cooperated and looked at the camera. After getting off the carousel, George dragged her to the pirate ship ride. Willow looked at the swaying pirate ship, her expression hesitant. "Isn't this a bit too intense?" No, it's super fun." Without giving her a chance to refuse, George pulled her onto the ride. The pirate ship started, swinging gently at first. Willow gripped the handle tightly, her lips pressed into a thin line. George took the initiative and reached out his hand. "If you're scared, hold on to me." Willow glanced at him but did not take his hand. Instead, she continued gripping the handle. The ship swung higher and higher. Screams rang out all around them. George secretly observed Willow's reaction. Her face had turned a little pale, but she still maintained a dignified sitting posture. She did not scream, nor did she grab onto him. This woman really could endure anything. In every sense, if endurance were a competitive sport, she would be the champion. Why was she even wasting time here? She should be out there sneaking straight to the enemy base and winning the whole game. After getting off the pirate ship, George took her on the bumper cars, the roller coaster, and into the haunted house. Willow did not like any of them, but she still accompanied George through every single one. Inside the haunted house, George finally found his chance. Pretending to be scared, he threw his arms around Willow's waist and pulled her completely into his embrace. "Aya, Willow, this is so scary. There's a ghost." George buried his face in her shoulder, his voice full of exaggerated acting. Willow's body stiffened for a moment, but then she relaxed. She reached out and patted his back. "It's fake, but I'm scared." George hugged her even tighter. Willow was silent for 2 seconds, then continued walking forward with a 6'2" human pendant hanging off her. Only after they walked out of the haunted house did George reluctantly let go. He sincerely sighed and said, "Willow, you're seriously brave." Willow glanced at him. "I guess so." That night, there was a fireworks show at the amusement park. George and Willow stood in the crowd, looking up at the fireworks blooming in the night sky. Fireworks burst overhead one after another, lighting up half the sky. George turned his head, about to say something to Willow, only to find that she was looking at him. The light of the fireworks flickered across her face. There was light in her eyes, but it was not the reflection of the fireworks. It was a kind of soft glow he had never seen before. "What's wrong?" George asked. "Nothing," Willow replied. She looked away and continued watching the fireworks. George's heart suddenly skipped a beat. He quickly turned his head back and forced himself to stare at the fireworks. However, at the most dazzling moment of the show, he felt a slightly cool hand gently and tentatively take his. George lowered his head and saw Willow's hand resting on the back of his. This was the first time Willow had taken the initiative to touch him. "Willow." His voice was a little hoarse. Willow said very softly, "There are too many people. I'm afraid we'll get separated." George said nothing. He turned his hand over and held hers tightly. Just like that, the two of them held hands and watched the entire fireworks show. George's mind was a complete mess. His plan, had something gone wrong somewhere? Chapter 14. The plan had indeed gone wrong. George lay on his bed, staring blankly at the ceiling for half an hour. Just now, after he had taken Willow home and said goodbye downstairs, Willow had taken the initiative to stand on tiptoe and kiss him on the cheek. Willow had said, "Thank you for keeping me company today." After saying that, she turned and quickly walked into the building. George stood rooted to the spot, completely petrified. She kissed him. She kissed him first. The legendary Willow, the one people said no one could even touch, had taken the initiative to kiss him. George touched the cheek she had kissed. The sensation of Willow's lips still seemed to linger there, soft and slightly cool, like a snowflake landing on his skin. In that instant, his mind went completely blank, but his heart was beating so fast it felt like it was about to burst out of his chest. What plan? What strategy? At that moment, all of it vanished into thin air. Only one thought remained in his mind: she kissed me. She doesn't hate me. George turned over irritably in bed. This was not right. According to the plan, she should have been so annoyed by now that she wanted to tear him apart. But why? Not only was she not annoyed, she had even taken the initiative to get close to him. This made no sense. Absolutely no sense. He took out his phone and opened his chat history with Willow. He scrolled up. It was full of his cheesy, over-the-top flirting and her short replies. "Good morning. Son. Willow replied, "Morning." George sent another message. "Send me your location. I want to see where my heart is." Expectant. Willow replied, "Okay, location. Baby, what are you wearing today? Take a picture and show me. I want to wear a couple outfit with you." Willow. Image. George looked at that photo. Willow was standing in her walk-in closet, wearing a pale yellow dress. She rarely wore such a bright color, and it made her skin look so fair it seemed to glow. She had actually taken a photo and sent it to him. George kept scrolling up. "I miss you. Willow replied, He asked, "Don't you miss me?" Wronged emoji. "I do." George stared at the word "do," and his heartbeat began to speed up again. Holding his phone, he read the messages over and over for a long time. Then, in despair, he realized something. He could no longer remember when he had stopped sending those messages to disgust Willow and had started sending them because he genuinely wanted to talk to her. Every morning, the first thing he did after opening his eyes was reach for his phone to see whether she had replied. Whenever he saw something interesting, his first reaction was to take a picture and send it to her. He was done for. George threw his phone aside and covered his face with a pillow. It seemed like he had really fallen for Willow. That realization made him feel both ridiculous and powerless. He had come up with this plan to make her hate him. In the end, the first one to fall had turned out to be himself. What was this? Self-inflicted punishment. Shooting himself in the foot. He had played himself. George let out a wail. Chapter 15. The next day, George showed up at the company with 2 dark circles under his eyes. David was startled when he saw him. "CEO Wang, did you not sleep well last night?" "Shut up," George said coldly. He sat at his desk, trying to focus on work, but his mind was full of Willow. What was she doing? Was her meeting over? Had she eaten lunch properly? And that kiss yesterday, what exactly had she meant by it? David stood beside him in silence for 2 seconds. "CEO Wang, you haven't followed the plan for 3 days. George froze. "What do you mean?" "According to the original plan, you were supposed to start deliberately creating embarrassing situations in public on the 5th day. For example, singing downstairs at Miss Liu's company, loudly confessing your love in a restaurant, or deliberately knocking over a glass of water to create conflict. But you haven't done any of that." George opened his mouth, wanting to argue, only to realize he had nothing to say. Still, he stubbornly said, "The plan has changed. I'm playing the long game. I have my own pace. Stay out of it." David pushed up his glasses and said nothing, but his expression clearly said, "Keep telling yourself that." George waved his hand irritably. "Get out first." He was the only one left in the office. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. In his mind, last night's fireworks appeared again, along with the moment she had taken his hand first and the kiss she had left on his cheek. He had to admit that Willow was different from what he had imagined. She was not emotionless. She was not an ice queen. She just did not talk much. She just was not good at expressing herself, but she responded to him with actions. She read every message he sent. She agreed to every request he made. Every time he reached out his hand, she took it. She had even started getting close to him on her own. Thinking of this, George's heart began pounding wildly again. No, he had to calm down. Even if he had started to like Willow, he could not forget the nature of this marriage alliance. It was a transaction. Willow had agreed to meet him to fulfill her family's task, not to fall in love. Her "suit yourself" and might only be because of her upbringing and sense of responsibility. That kiss might have only been out of gratitude. Did she really like him? George was not sure. Just as he was tangled up in his thoughts, His phone vibrated. It was a message from Willow. She sent, "I'm working overtime tonight. You don't need to come." George stared at that message for a long time. She was telling him not to come. Did this mean she thought he was annoying now? An indescribable feeling rose inside George. It was not pride. It was not happiness. It was disappointment. He should not have felt disappointed. His plan was to make her annoyed, to make her push him away on her own. Now that she was starting to push him away, he should have been celebrating, but he could not celebrate at all. He sat in his chair, staring at that message for a full 10 minutes. Then he made a decision that even he found absurd. He went to Liu Group. When George arrived, it was already 8 o'clock at night. Most of the windows in the Liu Group building were dark, with only a few scattered lights still on. He sent Willow a message, "I'm downstairs." 30 seconds later, Willow replied with a question mark. George replied, "Even if you're working overtime, you still need to eat. I brought you a late night snack." This time, Willow was silent for a full 2 minutes. "I'm coming." George leaned against the car and watched Willow walk out of the building. She had changed into casual clothes, a simple white t-shirt and jeans. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, and she had no makeup on. She looked as if she had rushed to tidy herself up before coming down. Chapter 16. Willow asked, "Why are you here?" She stopped in front of George. "Didn't I already say? I brought you a late night snack." George opened the car door and took a thermal bag from the passenger seat. "I had David buy it from Rui Pavilion. Your favorite crab roe soup dumplings and shredded chicken congee." Willow took the thermal bag and lowered her head to look at it. She said, "Rui Pavilion is a 40-minute drive from here, so you have to eat properly and not waste it." George reached out and rubbed her hair. Only after rubbing her head did he realize what he had done. The gesture had been too natural, as if he had done it thousands of times before. Willow did not dodge. She let his hand rest on her head for a few seconds. George withdrew his hand and said, "Go back upstairs. It'll get cold if you don't eat soon." "What about you?" Willow asked. "I'll go home." Willow was silent for a moment. "You haven't eaten either." George smiled. "I'll just eat something when I get home." "Come up." Willow interrupted him. "Let's eat together." George froze for a moment, then smiled. "Okay." He followed Willow upstairs. Willow's office was like her apartment, decorated in a minimalist style with black, white, and gray tones. But there was a bouquet on the desk, the preserved flowers he had given her a few days ago. George looked at that bouquet, and something in his heart was gently touched. She had placed it in her office, where she could see it every day. They ate the late-night snack on the coffee table in the reception area. There were crab roe soup dumplings, shredded chicken congee, and a few small side dishes. George asked, "You told me not to come, but I still came anyway. Are you unhappy?" Willow glanced at him. "What do you think?" George froze. This was the first time Willow had ever asked him a question back. He hesitated for a moment before saying, "I think you might actually be a little annoyed with me." "Why?" "Because I'm too clingy." For once, George told the truth. "I bombard you with messages, show up every day, and disrupt your plans. Anyone would get annoyed." Willow put down her chopsticks and looked at him. "George." She called his name, enunciating each word clearly. "I have never found you annoying." George froze. "But, didn't you avoid me at first? When I hugged you, you were obviously resisting." Willow lowered her eyes and stayed silent for a long time. She said, "I wasn't avoiding you." "Then what was it?" Willow did not answer. She stood up, walked to the window, and turned her back to him. "I have some issues." Her voice was very soft. "Physical contact with other people makes me uncomfortable. It has been like that since I was little." George stood up and walked behind her. "Then why?" Willow turned around and looked at him. "But you don't disgust me." There was only one floor lamp on in the office, its light dim and warm. Under that light, Willow's eyes seemed especially deep, filled with emotions George could not understand. She said, "I don't dislike it when you come close. I don't dislike your messages, your hugs, your touch, everything about you. I don't dislike any of it." George felt as if something had slammed hard into his heart. Willow looked away slightly. "So don't ask me whether I'm annoyed with you anymore. I won't be annoyed with you. Never." The office fell silent. George could hear his own heartbeat, loud as a drum. He looked at Willow, at the slightly red tips of her ears, at her fingers curling slightly because she was nervous. So she had not been enduring him. She had been accepting him. That realization struck like lightning, splitting apart all the confusion and hesitation in George's heart. Chapter 17. He reached out and gently turned Willow's face toward him, making her look at him. "Willow Liu." He called her by her full name, his voice a little hoarse. "What is it?" "I want to kiss you." Willow's eyes widened slightly. George did not wait for her answer. He lowered his head and kissed her, not on the cheek, but on the lips. Willow's lips were just as soft as he had imagined. She did not resist at all. After a brief moment of stiffness, she slowly closed her eyes. Her arms lifted and wrapped around his waist. George deepened the kiss. He kissed her carefully and seriously, as if he were handling a fragile treasure. He felt Willow trembling lightly in his arms. But it was not fear, not disgust. It was. He did not know what it was, but he knew it was not dislike. When they parted, both of their breathing was a little unsteady. Willow's lips were slightly red from the kiss, and her eyes were misted with a thin layer of moisture. She looked at George without saying anything. Willow. George cupped her face and wiped the dampness from the corner of her eye with his thumb. Don't say it. Willow interrupted softly. Don't say something like you'll take responsibility. George froze for a moment and asked, how did you know I was going to say that? Because you're George. Willow said. You may seem unserious on the surface, but deep down, you're painfully serious. George looked at her and suddenly laughed. He really had almost blurted out, I'll take responsibility for you. But now that he thought about it, he said, I like you. Willow's body trembled slightly. Not as part of the plan, not as an act. George looked into her eyes and said each word clearly. I truly like you. You're the first person I think of when I wake up in the morning and the last person I think of before I fall asleep at night. I want to hold your hand. I want to hug you. And I want to be with you. I don't know when it started, but I just really like you. Willow quietly listened to him finish. Then she lowered her head and buried her face in his chest. Her hands clutched the front of his shirt tightly. In a muffled voice, she said, George, what is it? Do you know how long I've waited to hear those words? George froze. What do you mean? Willow lifted her head and looked at him. There was a thin layer of moisture in her eyes, but there was a smile on her lips. It was the first time George had ever seen Willow truly smile. Not a polite smile, not a courteous smile, not a perfunctory smile. It was a smile that came from the bottom of her heart, impossible to hold back, bright enough to curve her eyes. Willow said, it means, you thought you were so smart, but you were actually an idiot. George's mind filled with question marks. Chapter 18. After that night, George and Willow's relationship entered an entirely new stage. George no longer needed to act. The way he treated Willow well became natural, sincere, and from the heart. As for Willow, although she was still quiet and still carried that cool, distant air, there was now a softness in her eyes that made one's heart stir. She would look at him seriously when he spoke. She would curve her lips when he smiled. She would take the initiative to slip her hand into his pocket. On weekend mornings, she would send him a simple message, I miss you. Those words alone could make him happy for an entire day. David felt that his boss had been acting like an idiot lately. He would zone out and smile foolishly during meetings, zone out and smile foolishly while reading documents, and even when he was being attacked by the stubborn old men on the board, there was still a strange look of happiness on his face. CEO Wang, are you all right? David finally could not help asking. I'm fine. What could possibly be wrong with me? George leaned back in his chair with a smile on his lips. By the way, how are things on the old man's side? David flipped through the schedule and said, the chairman is very satisfied. He said you've been performing well recently. Your relationship with Miss Liu is stable, and the cooperation between both families is moving forward smoothly. The Liu family is also very happy. They said someone has finally appeared who Miss Liu doesn't reject physical contact with. George fell silent for a few seconds. Right. He had almost forgotten. Willow had always been famously averse to physical contact, but with him, she had never truly resisted from the very beginning. Why was that? That night, George went to Willow's apartment. He knocked on the door. A few seconds later, the door opened. Willow stood in the doorway, wearing a loose sweater, her hair still damp. She had clearly just taken a shower. Willow asked in confusion, why are you? Before she could finish, George pulled her into his arms. He hugged her tightly, as if he wanted to press her into his very bones. George? Willow froze in his arms for a moment. What's wrong? Nothing. George buried his face in her damp hair and took a deep breath. I just wanted to hug you. Willow was quiet for a moment. Then she reached out and wrapped her arms around his waist. She said, then hug me. You don't need a reason. George smiled. His Willow was always this cool. He held her for a long time. So long that Doe came over, circled around them twice, and meowed in dissatisfaction. Willow said, it's jealous. Let it be jealous. George let go of her and held her hand instead. I have something to ask you. They sat down on the sofa. George held Willow's hand and looked into her eyes. Willow, George continued, you clearly hate being touched by other people, but you've never truly pushed me away. Why? Willow lowered her head and looked at their intertwined hands. After a long time, she finally spoke. Because it was you. George's heart gave a hard thump. She said, the first time I saw you was at a banquet 3 years ago. Willow's voice was very soft, as if she were speaking of a memory that had been sealed away for a long time. I was in a terrible mood that day, so I hid on the rooftop to get some air. You came up and didn't notice me. You were on the phone by yourself. You were talking about one of the company's charity projects. It seemed that the team under you wanted to donate money to an elementary school in a mountain area. Take a few photos for show. and call it a day. You sounded very angry that day. You said to the person on the other end of the phone, I don't care how other companies do it. Wang Group doesn't do performative charity. The textbooks and desks must actually arrive. Keep an eye on the nutritious lunches and make sure every child gets food in their bowl. If anyone tries to half-ass this and fool me, they don't need to come to work tomorrow. Chapter 19. George froze. He vaguely remembered something like that happening. That charity project had been part of an old district redevelopment plan in the south of the city. It was not a big project. After scolding his subordinates, he had turned around and forgotten about it. Willow said, Then you hung up the phone and only then realized there was someone else on the rooftop. You glanced at me, nodded, and left without saying anything. Just because of that, George could hardly believe it. You looked especially fierce when you were on the phone on the rooftop. But you weren't fierce because you were throwing a tantrum at someone. You were fierce because someone was trying to treat charity like a box to check off. Willow said. At that moment, I thought, if this man could take a non-profit charity project so seriously, then deep down, he couldn't be a bad person. For a moment, George did not know how to respond. Willow's voice was soft yet steady. I looked into the charity project afterward. You built new playgrounds for those 3 elementary schools, hired nutritionists to plan their meals, and even had designers redo the lighting plans for the school buildings. There were no media reports, no public promotion. No one knew you had personally overseen it. Why did you look into that? Because I wanted to know whether you were just putting on a show or whether you meant it. Willow said, and it turned out you were even better than I had imagined. The tips of George's ears began to heat up. In his life, people had praised him for being handsome, for making money, for being capable, but being called good, especially by someone as serious as Willow, made him realize for the first time that he actually had no idea how to handle it. Willow continued, After that, I started paying attention to you at all kinds of events. I would watch you from a distance. The corners of Willow's lips curved slightly. You always looked careless and unserious, joking around at banquets like you never took anything seriously. But when your secretary got sick, you remembered to have someone send medicine. When your friend got into trouble, you flew over overnight to help. When a family member of one of your employees was hospitalized, you quietly gave them money without letting anyone know. You never took credit for any of these things, but I knew. I felt that you were someone who talked like a reckless fool on the surface, but deep down, you were cleaner-hearted than anyone. George's ears burned completely red. Willow said, So when my family brought up the marriage alliance, I agreed. Although I didn't know whether you would ever like me, I was willing to take the chance. Then why didn't you say so earlier? George's voice was a little hoarse. All those clingy things I did at the beginning. I clearly should have hated them. Right, Willow replied. Willow smiled. It was the gentlest smile George had ever seen from her. But all the clinginess from you was the kind of closeness I had never even dared to dream of. I couldn't bear to delete a single message you sent me. I kept every gift you gave me. Every time you touched me, I remembered it in my heart. Do you know what that felt like? You thought you were scheming so carefully to force me to call off the engagement. But to me, it was the person I had waited 3 years for finally walking toward me. George was completely stunned. His so-called brilliant plan, in Willow's eyes, had actually been an active pursuit. From beginning to end, he had been outsmarting only himself, while she had been playing along with him the entire time. George looked at her eyes, at the smile at the corners of her lips, then he laughed. At first, it was a low chuckle, then it turned into loud laughter. I admit defeat. He laughed so hard he bent forward and backward. I really admit defeat. Willow, you win. He laughed for a long time, laughing until tears almost came out. When he finally finished laughing, he pulled her into his arms and held her tightly. Thank you, he said beside her ear. For what? George's voice was a little muffled as he said, Thank you for agreeing to this arranged marriage. Thank you for choosing me out of so many people. Willow said nothing, but she tightened her arms around his waist. Doe meowed twice in displeasure from under the sofa, then jumped up and squeezed between them. It really is jealous, George said with a laugh. Willow said, It needs to get used to it. Get used to what? Getting used to sharing me with you. George lowered his head and looked at the person in his arms. His heart felt so warm, as if there were a sun inside it. He said, Willow, let's get married. Willow lifted her head and looked at him, light shining in her eyes. Okay, she said. Chapter 20. 3 months later, George and Willow held their wedding. George stood at the end of the red carpet in a custom black suit, watching as Willow walked toward him with her hand resting on her father's arm. She was wearing a white wedding dress, and the veil covered most of her face, but George could see that she was smiling. It was the most beautiful sight in the world. Willow's father placed Willow's hand into George's and said solemnly, Treat her well. I will. George held that hand tightly. When they exchanged rings, George saw that Willow's eyes had turned red. He reached out and wiped the tears from the corners of her eyes, then lowered his head and whispered beside her ear, Don't cry. Your makeup won't look good if it smudges. Willow said, You'll still marry me even if it does. I will. George said, no matter what, I'll marry you. After the wedding, they were in the presidential suite on the top floor of the hotel. George took off his suit jacket, loosened his tie, and sat by the bed, watching Willow remove her makeup. She sat in front of the vanity, wiping away the makeup on her face little by little in the mirror. After removing it, her face looked clean and fair, with a purity that was even more charming than when she had makeup on. What are you looking at? Willow looked at him through the mirror. My wife, George said confidently. The corners of Willow's lips curved slightly. She stood up and walked over to him. She said, hug me. George opened his arms and pulled her into his embrace. The two of them fell onto the bed together, and Willow lay on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. George, you don't have to cling to me every day anymore. Why? Because no matter how clingy you are, Willow said, I'll only be happy. George tightened his arms around her. He said, then I have even more reason to cling to you. In this lifetime, you're the only person I'll cling to. Willow smiled, her laughter as light as a feather landing on his heart. Suit yourself, she said. Chapter 21 Extra. 5 years later, George sat on the living room carpet, holding a doll-like little girl in his arms. The little girl had just turned 3. Her nickname was Little Doe. Yes, the same name as that chubby ragdoll cat. According to Willow, both of them were round, clingy, and equally matched. Little Doe was tugging at George's shirt collar, babbling, Daddy, wife. George shouted toward the kitchen. Your daughter peed again. Willow walked out of the kitchen, still holding a plate of freshly cut fruit. She came over to George, crouched down, skillfully took their daughter from him, and began changing her diaper. 5 years had passed, and Willow had changed a lot. She still instinctively kept her distance from strangers, but around friends and family, she could now accept hugs and physical contact with ease. She would even act spoiled now, though only in front of George, wife. George watched her change the diaper with practiced ease and suddenly remembered something. What is it? George asked. Back then, why did you hate physical contact so much? Willow's hands paused. She looked up at George, her eyes calm. She said, because I used to have touch starvation. Touch starvation, George repeated. Willow lowered her head and continued changing their daughter's diaper. When I was little, my mom was sick, and no one hugged me. Later, I became unused to being touched. But I still really wanted to be hugged, George asked. So that day at the cafe, when I hugged you and your body went so stiff. Yes, but I wasn't rejecting you, Willow said. I was trying to hold myself back from hugging you in return. George froze. Your forceful closeness made me feel very safe. Willow picked up their daughter after finishing the diaper change and looked at the girl's eyes, which looked so much like George's. Softly, she said, thank you. Thank me for what? Thank you for not being scared away by how cold I was at first. Willow said, thank you for keeping close to me until I got used to your warmth. Without you, I might still be alone now. George looked at her eyes, and at the daughter in her arms. Then he suddenly pulled both mother and daughter into his embrace. Wife, the luckiest thing I've ever done in my life was hugging you at that cafe that day. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his voice muffled. And the stupidest thing I've ever done in my life was also hugging you at that cafe that day. Willow asked, why was it stupid? George laughed. Because at the time, I actually thought I was setting a trap for you. In the end, I was the one who got trapped. Willow laughed too. She leaned into his arms, feeling his warmth. George, she said softly, hug me every day from now on too, okay? And tell me you like me every day, okay? Little Doe struggled between them and cried out in dissatisfaction. Daddy, can't breathe. The two of them laughed at the same time. Little Doe wriggled out from between them and ran off to play with her building blocks. George and Willow were still holding each other, and neither of them was willing to let go first. Outside the window, the sunlight was just right, falling across the carpet like shattered gold. Doe crouched in the sunshine, flicking its tail back and forth. Everything was just right.